Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to Investing When It Counts, a global conversation with the authors of a new resource and action plan calling for greater investment in very young adolescents. This will be a 60-minute webinar. For the first 30 minutes, the co-authors of Investing When It Counts will share new research and recommendations on very young adolescents, and we'll save the remaining 30 minutes for question and answer. If you require any assistance during the meeting, please send us an email. You can email Irene Friedland, that is IFRIEDLAND @popcouncil.org for any assistance during the meeting, or you can go to our website, popcouncil.org/investwhenitcounts for detailed instructions on how to get assistance. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you the co-authors of Investing When It Counts. We have Martha Brady, Senior Associate, Operations Council, Poverty, Gender, and Youth Program. We have Kelly Hallman, Senior Associate, also at the Populations Council, Poverty, Gender, and Youth Program, and Catherine McCarthy, Research Coordinator and Data Analyst. I will hand it over to Martha to begin.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining. I'm delighted to be here today, and we're going to look at reviewing the evidence and charting course for very young adolescents, VYAs for short, the 10 to 14 age group. We have, if you note here's our document. It's about a 70-page document, just fresh off the press. It is a resource and action guide to look really at the distinctive needs of very young adolescents. This document, which is available in English, Spanish, and French, listed below on the Pop Council's website. In it, we try to illuminate the health and social dimensions of the lives of very young adolescents. We do so through several data sets, but primarily we use the Demographic and Health Survey data, the DHS data, which we have reanalyzed in different ways for 71 countries. The report sort of summarized efforts to look at a variety of outcomes and disaggregated by gender and age. We also identify specific gaps and areas for future investment. Keep on talking. I think also what we've done then in the document is to lay out at the end recommendations for research and programs. I wanted to situate this VYA Investing When It Counts documents within the context of our larger body of work at the Council on adolescence. We often sort of say our adolescent work is coming of age. We've had about 2 decades of work in adolescence. And you can see this slide here will just show a whole range of very practical tools, research information, all of which are available through the Population Council. Most are in English, Spanish, and French. And it's a very useful kind of set of practical tools for working with young adolescents, or adolescents in general. I just wanted to, again, remind us of about 10 years ago, the Population Council and UNFPA and WHO hosted a meeting on very young adolescents. It was the first time really to kind of take a look at what we knew about the lives of very young adolescents. And we produced this document. Many of you may have seen this, and that has been our kind of document for the past 10 years. And we felt that it was time to both update that, both from sort of a re-look at data, but also, importantly, introduce new topics that were not in this earlier version. We looked much more deeply into the areas around mental health, around young adolescents living in humanitarian and crisis settings, and migration and trafficking. We've also looked a bit more at the brain science, the emergence of brain science. So you'll see more of those discussions in this new document. And just to situate why are we interested and why is this important? We know that investing in very young adolescents is important for many reasons. First of all, because of the lives of young people and their future trajectory is important to them as individuals, but also to families and communities, and actually because of the population and demographics of it. And you'll hear a bit later about just, in fact, the size of this population. We know that very young adolescent work has traditionally been overlooked, and that's in part because the good news is they're relatively good health. So the disease burden is low at this time. And so typically there's been a lot of work on the under 5, certainly in the child health space, and then not that much program or research activities up until, you know, later adolescence when young people enter into sort of reproductive health related activities. So, but we feel that this is actually a critical life phase for shaping the future health and development. And if we've borrowed here from Sawyer et al., many of you will be familiar with this slide from Lancet, and as you see, if we look on the left-hand side, going from sort of early child development, which we've said has been well catered for in terms of many programs, and then you see right in the center in the green, puberty and social role transitions. And if there's one sort of distinctive characteristic of the 10 to 14-year-old is the beginning of puberty and the onset of puberty. And that has both important biological as well as social consequence. So that is a pivotal moment, and if girls enter puberty earlier than boys, and you'll hear a bit more about that later. So if we see this sort of jigsaw, if we look at the top in blue, you see the social determinants of health and the risk and protective factors, which can be handled through social education, economic interventions, and the lower half in green is more of the health-related behaviors and health outcomes, and those are treated best through health policies, preventive care, and health service delivery. So the trajectory can go for good or bad, goes one way depending on how much effort and work we put into it now. Next slide. So again, although we've said that overall it's a time of relative good health, and that is where the glass is half full, there are some areas of concern, and we just lay out a couple here. All of these are in more detail in the document, but in the interest of time, we're just going to highlight a few. The first being mental health. We learned that actually depressive disorders are the leading cause of health-related disability among girls of this age, and third among boys. This is actually quite a powerful statement. Again, relatively good health, but this is an important area, and we think this is an important area to look at for the future. The next major area is around nutrition, both what we call under and over nutrition. It's sort of the dual epidemics, if you like, of malnutrition and obesity. And so when you have on the one hand iron deficiency anemia is the second largest cause of health-related disability, particularly among girls. We know that the effects of inadequate or excessive food intake at this time also manifest later in life. And then finally, the non-communicable diseases related to nutrition, which essentially diabetes, obesity, and coronary heart disease, will be leading cause of death in many low and middle income countries looking in trajectory in the next decade or so. So this is a critical moment. Then the third major area we look at is sexual activity, reproductive health, and child marriage. You'll note here we see that about 11% of females and 6% of males report having had sex before age 15. Again, this is retrospective, asking an older age group about this. And we know the challenges of gathering good data on sexual activity, but despite that, it's important, I think, to recognize you have twice as many, essentially, girls reporting sex before age 15 than boys. When we do know, and this is pretty clear across all cultures and time, is that early sexual experiences are more likely to be coerced, tricked, forced, or in some way, shape, or form, particularly so for girls. Finally, the proportion of girls married before age 15, although not universally that large, remains substantial in some target countries. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Kate McCarthy, who's going to get a deeper dive into some of the data.
Thank you, Martha. So when thinking about the health, well-being, and opportunities to invest in young adolescents, an important consideration is the sheer size of this age group. There are roughly 600 million 10 to 14-year-olds living in the world today, and about 90% of these youth live in low-middle income countries. As we can see here on this map, countries where there is a darker shade of blue have populations where young adolescents comprise a greater share of the population. It's evident that this largely takes place in areas such as sub-Saharan Africa, and this is a region where the youth population is actually projected to grow in size over the next several decades. This means that countries that may be struggling to meet the health and educational needs of young adolescents may require increased support and resources to continue to do so in the future. When defining early adolescence, we can think of this period as a series of stages. These stages map onto the multiple biological, physical, and cognitive changes that youth undergo, starting with the onset of puberty, rather than as one homogeneous period. Although youth experience these processes in different ways and at different times, typically, girls experience onset earlier than boys. For both boys and girls, this can be a defining moment where physical changes signal social role and other external changes for which youth may or may not be emotionally and developmentally prepared for. In some settings, this can mean increased vulnerability to sexual coercion. It can mean leaving school and entering the labor force, and in some contexts, it can mean entering marriage or becoming a primary caretaker. My colleague Kelly will now discuss how these transitions can affect life circumstances.
Very early adolescence is a pivotal moment when lives can go off track. Outcomes with negative lifetime consequences can occur, such as early school leaving, child marriage, non-consensual sexual encounters, and unplanned pregnancy. The panel on the left-hand side of the slide shows, using 4 nationally representative data sets as case studies, the common pattern among BYA girls of school dropout accelerating at age 13, coinciding with the onset of puberty, gender role transitions, and transition to secondary school. The panel on the right-hand side of the slide illustrates, using national data from Guatemala, how falling off track in one area, here leaving school, may coincide with other negative transitions, in this case child marriage and early childbearing among indigenous girls aged 10 to 19. There are a number of critical domains that impact the VYA life stage. The figure on the right from Blum et al.'s 2012 Lancet article shows the ecological framework demonstrating multi-level and overlapping influences on VYA health and well-being. In our report, we examined several key social and contextual domains that shape VYA lives. Very early adolescence is typically a time when girls and boys reside with parents and are enrolled in school, thus spending a great deal of time in these two environments. These are key potential sources of protection, social support, and knowledge for shaping positive lifelong behaviors and decision-making skills. VYAs not in school and who do not reside with parents may lack access to these resources and be more vulnerable to negative outcomes. This is especially the case with the segment who do not go to school or reside with either parent. Additional influences may permeate these immediate environments and can undermine their potential utility. These include exposure to violence and harmful gender norms, which may cause disparities among VYAs in their ability to access and build social and human assets, as well as specialized vulnerabilities such as being a migrant, being trafficked, or living within a political conflict or crisis that interrupt access to potential support systems. Analyzing the factors that contribute to the development of health behaviors early on can help prioritize and target interventions. Such analysis is essential for identifying off-track adolescents and situations likely to increase their exposure to risk factors.
So to provide a snapshot of the context where very young adolescents reside, we analyzed the key social and contextual domains of interest, just nicely described by Kelly, for 71 low-middle income countries using nationally represented data collected by the Demographic Health Surveys, or the DHS. I'd just like to note that the DHS collects data on 10 to 14-year-olds using information at the household level or among individuals ages 15 or older to retrospectively recall their experiences. We use the DHS as well as other data sources referenced in our report to learn as much as we can about the environment where young adolescents reside. The table shown here is actually a snapshot of a larger table in the report, which also includes additional world regions. And here we're examining indicators of young adolescent engagement with the traditional support systems for this age period being school and family. In this report, we examine key social and contextual domains of interest and look at a number of indicators of young adolescent engagement with systems of support that are traditional for this age period, including schools and families. There are a number of indicators that are displayed here on this table, and one additional one was studying at grade for age, and this is among young adolescents who are enrolled in school. The graphs shown on this slide show case examples for 4 sub-Saharan African countries, again using data from the DHS. The horizontal lines here represent the proportion of adolescents who are enrolled at school at ages 10 to 14 and at ages 15 to 19. We can see here that the blue line represents boys and the green line represents girls. The main take-home point here is that there's a general downward slope in school enrollment for both sexes and that this is steeper for girls. When we looked at schooling outcomes across all DHS countries, we also found evidence that the transition to secondary school was a particular area that needed increased work, and this is particularly the case for girls. While not illustrated here, we also found that adolescents not being at grade for their age was also an area of challenge. In a multitude of countries, we found that almost half of young adolescents were not studying at grade for age.
This figure is from a report in our series entitled The Adolescent Experience in Depth. The series, available on our website, uses nationally representative data to present outcomes and key influence domains in adolescents' lives by gender, finely disaggregated age category, marital status, and subnational location. Girls who are not in school and do not reside with either parent are less likely to have access to support systems afforded through either domain and may be at increased risk for negative outcomes. The mapping data presented here use subnational level analysis to examine overlapping risks and reveal that up to 1 in 10 VYA girls in some areas of Guatemala are neither in school nor residing with either parent. This locational multi-outcome data can guide targeted programs for VYAs. Globally, a higher percentage of girls than boys in low and middle income countries live with neither parent and do not go to school. The highest percentage of VYAs living with neither parent are in sub-Saharan Africa. As mentioned previously, exposure to violence can imbue domains of school and family and undermine the benefits of these otherwise supportive systems. Our Adolescent Experience in Depth guide, which used the DHS data from Liberia, pointed to the VYA period as one of particular concern for girls. In collaboration with Innovations for Poverty Action and the International Rescue Committee, the Council led a baseline survey of rural girls aged 13 to 14 in one of Liberia's 15 counties to measure their experiences of sexual and other types of violence in preparation for a randomized intervention that is now underway called Girl Empower. The survey revealed that almost 4 in 10 girls have already experienced a non-consensual sexual encounter at this very young age. The survey used validated scales, including detailed questions from the Violence Against Children surveys, which are being conducted by UNICEF, CDC, and their respective national partners. These systematically measure physical, emotional, and sexual violence against boys and girls, as well as protective factors, health consequences, and use of services. These can be used to guide programs, policies, and resources to develop better child protective systems. Of note in this slide is the young age of the respondents and the sensitive nature of the questions that were asked. Great care and appropriate training of the research team is absolutely necessary to investigate such issues among VYAs. However, it is possible to do so and to gain IRB approval of the research if a strong case is made from the beginning on the prevalence of the problem among this young population, as well as the possibility for testing a potentially efficacious intervention.
Thank you. We're going to sort of shift gears a bit. Kate and Kelly just went through quite some interesting data. The report is filled with data. We hope that you'll be able to read that. We did want to touch a bit on the progress being made programmatically for VYAs. While on the one hand we do say that VYAs tend to fall through the cracks of both policy, program, and research, and there are relatively very few large-scale programs for very young adolescents and even fewer that have been rigorously evaluated. Despite that, there's actually a number of activities underway, and I would just say we are very much aware of the work of Georgetown, Save the Children, WHO, and many others, I'm sure many of you on the line, that have been increasingly putting effort into programs to target this age group. So there's emerging evidence and some good ideas of programming promise. So we're going to go through just briefly, next slide, is some interventions, what we say, interventions of promise. And we won't go through all of them. They all discussed in the report. We will give attention to parenting interventions, what we know and don't know about that, programs around education transitions. As we've discussed, the good news is most young adolescents have made it through primary, and this is the time from primary to secondary education where we see the dropping off, the tailing off of that transition. So really targeting the transition period, which does fall into this age group of 10 to 14. The third major area is what we've called sort of health awareness and disease prevention. In this, we talk about health wellness checks, including mental health and physical activity. We also, those are the three we'll kind of touch on mostly in this, but we do also in the report highlight comprehensive sexuality education. There's a lot we know about that, and that is mentioned in the report, as well as puberty programming. And again, given that puberty is, as I said, a distinctive feature of this age group, the importance around programs around that time. And then finally, and importantly, we know that gender norms are still mutable at this time, and so there's much work around transforming gender norms and to more equity and rights-based, and there's been a lot of work around that that we mentioned again in the report. I'll hand it to Kelly.
This slide summarizes existing evidence on education and parenting interventions in low and middle income countries. As Kate mentioned, there is progress in primary school completion, but particular challenges remain in West and Central Africa, as well as selected MENA countries. Attention to the transition to secondary school is needed. Half of all 10 to 14-year-olds in low and middle income countries are not at grade for age. Education interventions, however, have been shown to be effective. Parents and students underestimate the benefits of schooling, especially for girls. Financial cost is another barrier to schooling. Unconditional cash transfers, as well as conditional cash transfers, have been shown to be effective, with CCTs having a larger impact, especially on girls. School-based health interventions can increase the demand for education. These include school feeding, deworming, iron and iodine supplementation, and a new area which has a possibility for impact, gender-separate latrine provision. Parenting interventions also are a promising path forward. Most BYAs live with at least one parent, and parenting skills have been shown to be effective, at least with studies in high-income countries. They've shown to improve parent-adolescent communication and relationship satisfaction, to reduce abusive behaviors by parents, to increase mental health and social functioning of BYAs, as well as healthcare investments made by parents with their children. In the low and middle income countries, however, there are very few studies that focus on the BYA age group. Most studies are with much younger children. Most collect either parent or child self-reported outcomes and not both. The vast majority focus on parent-child communication and not on more consequential parenting behaviors such as healthy disciplinary methods or emotional support for education, goals, and aspirations. There are no studies with direct observation of parent-child interactions either. Given the positive impacts in low-resource settings of high-income countries, these interventions hold promise for low- and middle-income countries.
So earlier, we defined mental health issues as the largest source of poor health among 10 to 14-year-olds. In fact, an estimated 50% of lifetime mental health disorders have onset by age 14. The slide here illustrates a set of risk and protective factors that have been identified from the work of Vikram Patel and others, and which can be targeted by programs to promote positive mental health. As you can see on the left-hand side, these occur across several levels, including biological, physiological, and social, with the social domain being comprised of the family, school, and community levels. For example, in the social domain, this can include protective factors such as positive family attachment as well as school connectivity. A recent review of mental health promotion interventions in low-middle income countries for young people highlighted the potential of multi-component programs. For example, one program paired school-based emotional skills training with inputs at the family and community levels. While this work shows promise, we should note that while 90% of the world's youth live in low middle-income countries, only 10% of randomized controlled trials have been conducted in these settings. There's a large need to strengthen both awareness as well as measurement of mental health issues among young people in these settings. This is really critical because the ages of 10 to 14 are a time period where social relationships are established, educational habits are formed, and the uptake of risk behaviors also occurs. Unmet mental health needs in this period can interfere with these normative processes and hinder youth from reaching their full developmental potential.
Very young adolescents residing in acute, specialized circumstances such as crises or emergency settings, those engaged in voluntary migration, and their partners with very young adolescent girls in humanitarian contexts. The I'm Here acronym connotes the steps in this approach for reaching BYA girls. These include identifying specific crises-affected communities, making the universe of adolescent girls visible, holding group meetings with girls of specific vulnerabilities and capabilities to learn of their urgent needs, elaborating specific segments of girls to respond to the crises, and also rallying support across humanitarian sectors and engaging the capacity of girls themselves to support recovery programs and operations.
Thank you. Kelly just touched on the situation for very young adolescents in very challenging circumstances. This next slide kind of is focused on kind of more of a health promotion and wellness checkup approach, and this is probably most appropriate in more emerging middle-income countries or less challenging circumstances, let's say. And this is actually an idea that we have been working with over the past several years of sort of seeing this time period as an important time to experiment with different kinds of health promotion and wellness checkups. So, for example, if you look on the left-hand side of the slide under health, these are all the types of health interventions we think are important during this age group. You know, immunization and review and checkup for those who've maybe missed out on immunizations previously, an overall physical exam, which we know that actually many young people do not get. They've been well catered for as under 5s, but then nothing really happening until later on. This is also a time for those that are going to be getting the HPV vaccine. This is the age group for which that is appropriate. We've listed out this is speaking to this issues around mental health and violence screening. We also, this is just illustrative, and we think that much more experimentation is needed. The Council and others have experimented with some of these components in Rwanda and other settings. The extent to which we have strong evidence around what works on this is less clear. But we think ultimately that it's important to kind of build a culture of health among young people. So see it as a very positive approach, and I think thinking longer term, it can help shape demand actually for health services for young people and get them into a notion, this concept of health, a culture of health. Okay, we'll end on this. Just again, with that in mind, it is the year of the Olympics. They're coming in July. So just one last point out here again is the importance of nutrition, physical activity, and sport. And one of the things that we do know is that in fact it actually helps improve health fitness for life, and that it actually can reduce chronic disease and boost mental health by reducing the symptoms of stress and depression. So that's one other sort of example of kind of program intervention that can be attempted in some settings. Handing it back to Kate.
So I'm just going to summarize now some key recommendations that we have for future research, and we really need this to make the case for a greater attention to VYAs and the diversity of circumstances really that shape their lives. So we argue for strengthening in several areas. The first is to validate methods for gathering information among VYAs themselves to confirm what can be accurately reported among young adolescents. And this may include differentiating tools and techniques that work for boys versus girls, as well as younger versus older adolescents. We also think it would be useful to establish a data repository of information on very young adolescents. along these lines, the report is a first step in this direction in that we reference and describe a number of sources of information on young adolescents. This includes surveys that interview youth directly and also include information on them through other reporting methods. To gain as much insight as we can about the context where young adolescents reside, we argue for conducting fresh analysis of existing data that's disaggregated by age and sex, and we recommend doing this in 2 to 3 year age intervals given the multiple transitions that young adolescents undergo. We need both measurement and programmatic focus on marginalized groups of young adolescents, including young married girls, boys and girls who reside in urban slums, migrants, refugees, and other groups. And we need to build the program evidence base about what works for what segments of young adolescents and under what circumstances, and embed this research into program initiatives. And finally, we need research to guide the scale up and to measure the impact of such efforts. So in sum, why do we argue for more programmatic evidence and research on young adolescents? In general, young adolescents have been overlooked in the global public health and development agenda because relative to other life phases, this is generally a period of good health. However, as young people begin to transition to adulthood, this picture changes. Behaviors, practices, and decisions made in early adolescence affect health and outcomes in later adolescence and throughout life. The time to prevent the disease burden that rises dramatically in later adulthood is in this age period, before behavioral patterns are set and while social norms and circumstances are more in flux. Today's youth will be tomorrow's adults, so the time to invest in good health is now. So I'd just like to thank you all for joining us for this webinar. If you'd like to learn more, we will be at Women Deliver. If you will also be attending, you can join us for coffee with Martha Brady, and you'll see the booth number is listed there. You can also download the report online at the URL listed on this slide. The report is available in English, French, and Spanish. And finally, you can join the conversation at #InvestWhenItCounts. Thank you very much.
Many thanks all. We have about 25 minutes or so for a question and answer. There are 3 ways that you can ask a question. You can send a chat to the Population Council host located on your screen. You can also send an email to us at the email address here on this slide, to Irene Friedland. Or you can raise your hand to ask a question yourself, and we will unmute the line if you have a question, and you can ask it directly of one of the co-authors. So let me pause for just a moment while we take our first question. The first questions we received here is, why do we think that only 10% of randomized controlled trials are happening among BYAs in the developing world? And the authors.
My response to that question would be that in these settings, generally the first priority is responding to the actual health needs and addressing the issues among adolescents. So research sometimes comes second in this area of focus, and so really what we need to do is prioritize the measurement of mental health issues into systematic systems that are ongoing to make sure that it's continuous and that it's incorporated with larger health systems.
We have one question coming in on our chat from Caitlin Mitchell, and Caitlin asks, how generalizable are the findings reported, e.g. that 4 in 10 girls ages 13 through 14 in Nimba, Liberia have had a forced sexual experience? So how generalizable are the findings that were reported vis-a-vis Liberia?
Sure. Thank you for that question. The survey in Nimba County, Liberia, was of all rural girls residing in communities of size 500 to 2,000 residents. And so we cannot say that this is necessarily typical for Liberia as a country, nor is it typical of West Africa or of the sub-Saharan African continent generally. What we do know is that those levels among these very young girls are much higher than those that have been reported by the Violence Against Children surveys in any of the countries where they have been conducted. So it is quite a high level, and it's something that we suspected for Liberia given our DHS analysis that we did before the study even started. But we can't say it's generalizable. It's only for that specific geography and population.
So, and that's true in general. Sort of when you have a study of a particular thing, it is not generalizable to sub-Saharan Africa or to several other countries. It is of that region or context. So,
I guess another point on that is that because we included very detailed questions about each type of specific sexual experience, and we didn't just ask, have you experienced non-consensual sex? It's, have you been touched sexually? Has anyone attempted to have sex with you unsuccessfully? Has anyone tried to persuade or coerce you to have sex? Has anyone physically forced you to have sex? So those more detailed questions around specific types of experiences yield higher percentages of the problem than just one general question like often the DHS asks.
And the other point on that, I think, Kelly, is just one of the things that we have argued in our adolescent program in general is, in fact, you want to get to, if you want to design programs, you need to get to the specificity of the context. And, you know, this is a large group of young people, and so you want to find out who you want to reach with what, for what outcomes. And to do that, you really need to granularize the data in that way and look at these hot spots. And that's, I think, an example of that. And we have some of the other work that the Council has done in other areas has touched on that.
Great. And we have another question coming in. Can you please talk about the key results related to SRHR needs of very young adolescents? And what do you identify as priority areas to address as it relates to SRHR of BYAs?
When looking at, I think you must be referring to the slide early on where we sort of highlighted a couple of concerns. We looked at, again, the sexual activity, where we saw 11% of females and 6% of males reporting having had sex before age 15. This, again, comes from DHS data. It comes from older age group reporting backward, right? And so, you know, that's just, I think what the highlight there is that, you know, the twice as many females are responding to that than males. We do know that the earlier sexual experiences, in particular this age group, tend to be forced, coerced. And then on the early marriage front, it's in the report, the full report. The good news is there's not that many 10 to 14-year-olds that are actually married. In countries where early marriage is really a problem, there still is a significant proportion, but that's not most of the world. That's actually a few pockets of that. So your questions about SRH, I guess those are the main areas we covered in this report. What was the question again specifically? They wanted to know.
Key priority areas to address for the SRH.
Well, I think one of the priority areas for work is just around both, I think, which you can call it SRH, but I think it's around gender norms and behaviors and around puberty. Now, those two topics are really important, and both of those coalesce actually in this age group. Yeah, Kelly had a point.
Yeah, for this age group, many of them are not accessing any type of health service, including sexual and reproductive health, and so reaching this population through school-based programs and interventions, particularly at primary school before many of them drop out of school, such as comprehensive sexuality education, is really key for this period of life.
And just one other point, and I think we made mention of it earlier in our remarks, but if not, it warrants further discussion, is this 10 to 14 age cohort is still actually too large. We really think we need to parse the age more finely. A 10-year-old is actually quite different than a 14-year-old, and you know, and the world doesn't operate in 5-year DHS cohorts, thankfully. That's not how the world runs. So, and I think particularly related to sexual reproductive health, I mean, a 10-year-old who's who needs a sexual reproductive health service probably needs a lot of other things as well. The likelihood that it's coerced is probably very high. The likelihood that it's someone known is probably very high. And so that, the interventions one would do are actually quite different than perhaps someone who's 14 who may or may not be in some sort of relationship and could theoretically access the health service. So I think it argues for disaggregate, 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 and context, 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 and then sort of, there's no one-size-fits-all, I think, to the point of what an SRH, what you prioritize. I think it depends on the where and the specificity of the population.
Great. And we have a caller on the line, Eileen Yam, if you would like to address your question to the co-author.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed this presentation. It was crystal clear and fascinating. Quick question for you. So we, under the Link Up Project, did a household survey in Uganda looking at 10 to 24-year-old adolescents, young people's attitudes towards gender norms. So we used the GEM scale. And what we really would have liked to have done is look at how these 10 to 14-year-old attitudes were correlated with certain outcomes, whether it's violence or sexual risk. And, you know, as you alluded to, we just weren't allowed to ask those questions, the more sensitive outcome questions. But we did find that the GEM scale worked for that younger age group, and in fact, their attitudes were already quite inequitable, even more so than the older, the 15 to 24s. And I'm just wondering, you know, for something like a household survey, it may just be we weren't in a position to make the case that, no, we actually do know this is a problem among 10 to 24-year-olds, 10 to 14-year-olds. And I just wonder, you know, in a situation like ours, we felt like it was somewhat of a missed opportunity because we did get to talk to these young people, but just couldn't go that extra mile of asking about the outcomes we ultimately cared about. So I'm just wondering, you know, next time we find ourselves in this situation, what tack could we have taken and what might have worked better for us to just even get permission to go ahead and ask these questions?
Eileen, thanks for the question. I think one of the things that would be important is to draw upon data that elucidates the experiences and outcomes of the 10 to 14-year-old age group, and the Violence Against Children surveys is a very good source of such information. There hasn't been one conducted in Uganda, but they have been conducted in both Kenya and Tanzania. So I would put the case forward for the rather large percentage of sexual experiences, many of them non-consensual, for that particular age group, and make the case that attitudes are important, and this is a time when potentially attitudes could be changed, influenced, more so than with an older age group. So I would really draw upon other data sets from neighboring countries in the region that have either outcome or behavioral data on the 10 to 14-year-old group.
Yes. The other thing I would just like to add to that, Eileen, is just, I don't know in this particular case, but one of the things that we do find is that, you know, the cognitive capacity of young adults is actually quite different. So I don't know in your survey what questions you asked, but asking a 10-year-old the same question as a 24-year-old might not actually be the best approach. I mean, a lot of time I think needs to be spent in figuring out how you go about asking questions for this age group, particularly younger than 12. It's a very different cognitive development stage as well. So just that, I guess that's a point about methodology and sort of how we go about designing questions, who you're asking them of, et cetera. And a lot of effort. I know Kelly has spent a lot of time in working on that part of this equation, which is not insignificant.
We did do, not the GEM scale, but something very similar to it among the 13, 14-year-old girls in Liberia, and it worked very, very well. But we didn't have any younger respondents, but it may not have worked as well for a 10 to 12-year-old age group, but it was very effective with the 13 and 14-year-old girls.
We have about 5 minutes left, so hopefully we'll take about 3 more questions. Just a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question directly of the co-authors, please raise your hand on the WebEx menu bar. But in the meantime, we'll take a couple more that have come in over chat.
Great. We now have a question from Regina Benavides. She wants to know more about the mental health risk and protective factors. She says that this is a very difficult area to assess. And could you please share a little bit more about how you did it? So how you assessed mental health risk and protective factors.
Thank you for the question. So risk and protective factors have been identified through a number of people's work, including the work of Vikram Patel and Susan Sawyer, and really developing core indicators that can measure mental health in a way that we can systematically assess some of these factors and how they influence mental health issues, I think is critical in considering how we measure what may be a risk and the protective factors for these outcomes. This is a challenging area because the issue of mental health itself and how we measure mental health outcomes is already a challenge. A lot of times this relies on classifications from the DSM-5, but there is some change in this area in moving away from clusters of symptoms and focusing on other processes that may be more standardized, as not all adolescents may experience or show signs of the same issues in the same ways. So I think this area of measurement is really one where we need greater attention and more work.
Just to add to that, we used mental health scales in VYA work in Liberia and in Tanzania recently. So there have been instances of those validated scales being used among low and middle income country VYAs.
And just one other thing to add is that, and I think we all recognize that the challenges of both the measurement and how you're classifying, et cetera. I think one of the things we wanted to do in the report is actually to at least bring this otherwise taboo subject actually to the fore, because it does seem to be an important issue, and how we tackle it, how we think about it, I think is not set in stone, it's not clear, but it is something that we really probably do need to pay attention to, and does have, you know, long-term sequelae that actually will land up somewhere later we'll be trying to address. So I think the part of this was to sort of bring it up, raise a couple points, pull the data such as this, where Kate has discussed, and then sort of, you know, so there's no easy prescription here, so to speak.
And sorry, just one final thing on that question. If you're looking for additional resources on mental health, one is the Mental Health Gap Action Program, MHGAP, which does provide evidence-based recommendations on ways you can scale up services in low-middle income countries, and may be useful for you. This is developed by WHO, and you can find it online.
We have time for one more question, and we'll just leave the slide up on how you can get access to the report, learn more at Women Deliver, and join the conversation online. Last question.
Great. Our last question is about whether or not we should be tailoring interventions around gender. So it's asked whether interventions should focus specifically on girls or boys, or if they can be combined, and whether community-based platforms can be used for such interventions that target BYAs.
I think that's a good question, and it's sort of an age-old question. I think it's probably true for older adolescents as well, this notion of sort of whether you do girl-specific programming or gender-neutral programming or gender-combined programming. And I think there's different arguments to be made, and I think it depends on context. I do think that community-based platforms do make a lot of sense, particularly in many places. And so we have sort of, I think, taking gender into account is important. How that materializes in an actual program depends, again, on, to some extent, on what outcomes you're trying to achieve, for what reasons, for what population. So the more specificity and clarity about that will help you do smart program design. And that could be, in certain settings, you know, it could be a combined male and female program. It could be one that sequentially adds in boys into a program. It could be many different permutations. But I think the important thing is sort of the smart design element, which is sort of know what it is you're trying to do, what outcomes you're trying to reach, what populations you want to reach for what reason, and then design according to that. I don't know if my colleagues have any other points on that.
I think knowing the population in the local setting is key. We have a tool that we use here. It's called the Girl Roster, but basically it's doing a sort of census within the community of very young adolescents and knowing who is there, which particular vulnerabilities they have, and one of the key points here is what proportion of them go to school, because if a very high proportion are in school, school might be a more effective way to reach very young adolescents, whereas in settings where many of them are out of school, community-based would be a more effective way to deliver a program.
Thank you all. We're just at the hour now. Thanks everyone for participating. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded. It will be posted later this week on the link on your screen, popcouncil.org/investwhenitcounts. Please do refer to it, share it with colleagues. Please go to our website and download the reports, share them with colleagues, and please join us at Women Deliver for further conversation with Martha Brady. Thanks all, and apologies again for some of the technical issues. Have a great day.